Start recording. Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So we are continuing with Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. We are covering chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and then skipping to and doing 24 and 25.
Yep.
So we're covering a lot.
Yes, quite a lot.
I guess, it's so there's a lot, obviously, 'cause we're covering a lot of ground here. But I guess I want to start with the idea of the sovereign being like more of an office than a person.
Yeah, it's like a
Um,
representative.
yeah, it's like I mean, it takes one. It takes a little bit of thought to like grasp it, right? Because we're so used to. I mean, if we talk about a person, or we talk about if we talk about a person, we tend to think about like a human being. Although philosophically, personhood, and he does go into what is a person to some degree
Hmm.
in one of the chapters. Even though personhood is broader than an actual human being. So I think it's maybe. I mean, I don't know. At one point, it's sort of strange because it's sort of like, well, what is this? What is an artificial person? That we are giving up an enormous amount of our freedom to.
Right.
If not all. Uh, but then at the same point, the flip side of that is that given our ability to abstract and think about, the nature of personhood beyond the confines of an actual human being, maybe it is easier to sort of understand. Like
Right.
we could talk about. I mean, we talk about corporation. We talk about corporations being persons, being
Hmm.
like legal persons, and
Yeah.
that is a clear abstraction. Um, and people within the animal rights um, movement talk about sort of the personhood of certain animals, right?
Hmm.
And as soon as you do that, then you're getting outside of like the simple reduction to the person being just simply a human being. Um,
Right. And it all has to
so it's
do
sort of
with
interesting.
like
Like
the
I watched.
contracts.
Correct. Exactly. I watched the inauguration yesterday, and it was sort of like interesting, like reading this today as a juxtaposition, sort of
Hmm.
this transfer of power, where there's so much about it that is just very abstract, you know,
Yeah.
but we all, I mean, maybe not we all, but most of us recognize it, as in terms of like, yes, this is this, the office holds the person is sort of filling this role for X number of years, but the office is, in a sense, something greater than the individual person, because the individual person will die off or resign or leave office, but the office itself will be maintained.
Hmm. Yep.
Um, and you're absolutely right. The artificial person is totally the creation of the contract, right?
Yeah.
This covenant, this contract brings the office into being. So, um, even though all of the elements that bring it about are natural, it itself is artificial. The contract's artificial. The office is artificial, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, so yeah. Um, Connected to that is then like the power of the sovereign,
Hmm.
and I'm sort of feeling that, given what I know about you and what I know about myself, the extent of the power might not sit well with us. And I'm curious, like, yeah, I mean, if I pose the question, to what extent um, does Hobbes' portrayal of the extent of the power of the sovereign um, sit well with you?
Um.
Because it seems to be unlimited, and if it's and that seems, I don't know. I mean, no, as Americans that really pride ourselves with freedom and liberty, and all of these, the Bill of Rights, etc. It seems that the notion of unlimited power would not sit well with us, because then there's the question of how much is our freedom being squelched, how much is it being hampered.
Yeah, I don't think I actually have too much of an issue with it because of how modifiable the position of the sovereign is, right? Like it fits into, it's basically like an abstract substitute for any government, right? Like our governmental rules fit within the sovereign, right? Because our contracts, like we have the the balances of the three systems working together.
Right.
We have rules that are defined already, and the sovereign is it isn't one person necessarily in our government, right? It's kind of that whole structure. So I feel like from an abstract sense, giving the sovereign absolute power makes sense, because that basically means that your contracts can have full reign.
Right.
If that's how you set it up. But in our government, it's limited by the confines of what we've created.
Right.
Right. And I think you can expand
But
that,
also,
like in a monarchy too. They that would be more like that would be taking more advantage of the sovereign's rights, because you're putting it basically in one person. You don't have as many checks and balances. So yeah, I don't have too much of an issue with it at an abstract.
But at the same point, I think that I think that there might be one issue, and that is that we are taking a constitutional form of government, so your example, and then putting it in the place of the sovereign, Hobbes sovereign.
I don't think
know
there's an issue.
that would. Well, why? Because those three branches are essentially sovereign.
They are, yeah, they are.
Those three like in other words, it's as if it is the artificial man that's just tripartite.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you had a democracy, then all of the people who make up the democracy would be the sovereign, and then whatever rules that require those people to act the way that they do. Like it's not rested in one single person in that instance.
Right.
Like in a monarchy, it is, and I feel like the correlation in a monarchy is very one-to-one. But in other systems of government, the sovereign is more the body of governing power, I guess.
Sure. Because I'm wondering, I'm just wondering if there is a distinction between the tripartite, whatever, constitutional, United States form, versus the monarchical Hobbesian form. So one way to get around that is by just saying that, hey, you know what? We're talking about an abstract office. That office can be filled with, in the United States, three branches of government, or that office can be filled with a monarch, right? And the argument sort of still flows from there. But I'm wondering whether or not there is sort of like a distinction that, because unless one of us is a monarchist, we might see there being a problem with monarchy. In fact, maybe that's the next question. Like, if you had to sort of say which would you want, a monarch or tripartite government, which would you say, and why? And does that comment on, does that comment or share a criticism of one of them over the other?
Sure. So one thing I want to say is in chapter 19 at the beginning, the first paragraph towards the end, it says, when the representative is one man, then is the commonwealth a monarchy. When an assembly of all that will come together, then it is a democracy or a popular commonwealth. When an assembly of part only, then it is called an aristocracy. Other kind of commonwealth there can be none. For either one or more or all must have the sovereign power, which I have shown to be an indivisible entire. So I think that's kind of an example of that this idea of the sovereign power fits with with multiple kinds of governments, right?
Yeah. No, I
Um,
see that, and I did read that.
so, but then I guess your question is which one is preferable?
Yeah, because he does talk on page 241,
Hmm.
middle of. He's like the difference between these kinds of commonwealth consisteth not in the difference of power,
Hmm.
but in the difference of convenience, or the aptitude to produce the peace and security of the people, which is the first natural law,
Hmm.
um, for which they were instituted. So yeah, I mean, it seems that and is it safe to say in the rest of the section then that he sort of is arguing more for the convenience of the monarchy versus the other two?
I think so, yeah. I think that's what he's trying to argue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he does mention a few inconveniences about it.
Yeah. Here's
Um,
a good one. If you look at top of 243, is like fourthly, that a monarch cannot disagree with himself out of envy or interest, but an assembly may. So, and that's true, right? It
yeah.
takes a while for a bill to pass from the House to the Senate, signed by the president, right? But that would not be the case with the monarchy. So the point that you were making, not a difference in power, but basically in how that power is implemented,
Yeah, and organized.
how smoothly it's implemented, or how quickly you can get things done.
Hmm.
So, for example, Biden is inaugurated, and this happened with Trump, and this happened with other presidents in the past. And then what do? They sign all these executive orders immediately,
Hmm.
right? And these executive orders do not need to go through the whole sort of congressional process of passing a bill and the arguments and the time taken for that and the negotiations, etc.
Hmm.
You know, uh, just him signing it makes it so.
Right.
um, which by the way, which goes to show sort of this convenience element, right? If I can just make the law, um, I can get it done more quickly. It can be instantly implemented.
Hmm.
So yeah, you're right, and I guess there is sort of a I mean, you're right on this point. I still want to go back to the unlimited power thing,
Hmm.
but I think you're right on this point about um, and actually to give him credit too, that there is an element of flexibility, right? I mean, he might be if the argument is an argument from convenience, he's not necessarily disregarding the other two forms of government, right?
Right.
It's just basically saying this one can get stuff done faster.
Yeah.
But still, the unlimited power. I guess the reason it doesn't sit well is that I feel, maybe I haven't fully thought it out, but I feel that at some level, then my individual liberty, which by the way he does address in this reading, but I feel like my individual liberty to some extent is hampered, um, and you know because there's he even seems to say that the sovereign can never act unjustly, but it does seem that if the sovereign does certain things that are against the people, so let's say for instance, like the basis is preserved, the minimum is preserved, so peace and security, great, but at the same point, I'm not able to exercise my freedoms in other ways that let's say are important to me. um,
What do you
uh,
mean?
well, I'm trying to give you an example. I mean, I don't know. The one that pops in my mind right now is like, uh, um, so peace and security is taken care of, great. But then let's say that the sovereign, within a state ends up dictating that only heterosexual couples can be married.
Hmm.
And let's say that I'm not heterosexual, and this is part of, my identity, and I want to exercise my ability, to be married to same sex, um, and then I can't. So
Okay.
some of my freedom to exercise an interest or um, whatever, my own personal flourishing as I see it, is then curbed. because if I go back to the position that, well, no, the sovereign has ultimate power, and the sovereign has said these marriages cannot these are not legal, and therefore won't have all of the benefits associated with marriage, let's say, and there are, right? We know that. Then it would be problems like that I would have. Like, what's the recourse?
Okay. So I feel like I understand the concern, and I feel like
Or not, or we can add to something like this, like let's say, like during the Middle Ages, or in a theocracy, okay,
yeah,
which I know he doesn't address, but you could just connect that to monarchy, okay.
yeah,
So there's a state religion, but I don't want to practice that state religion,
okay.
you know. That would be similar to the same-sex marriage one.
So I feel
There's
like
some element, yeah,
what's happening is if you don't like the contracts of the sovereign that you're under, then you need to find a different sovereign to a degree, right?
yeah,
Like why you wouldn't want to make a contract with something you don't agree with, right? And
yeah.
yes, you grow up in that, but you can leave. Is kind of how I see it. And yes, it's unfortunate,
Hmm.
and maybe you should find a sovereign that is more flexible, um, right? Like a government that's more flexible or fits your desires and needs more.
Well, let me pose this then. What? So you're right if we hold to the idea that the sovereign should have unlimited power, but then I pose the question: why should the sovereign have unlimited power?
It should have unlimited power because otherwise you can't resolve all the conflicts that you might otherwise be able to resolve. I feel like.
Hmm.
Um, like it's not if it doesn't have unlimited power, then it can't be dynamic enough to adapt to new situations. If it doesn't have unlimited
Hmm.
power, right? Like I don't know. One of the things that was interesting in chapter 18 was, I guess, number 5. It said, "Whatsoever the sovereign doth is unpunishable by the subject," which is an
Hmm.
interesting concept. I mean, this is kind of what we're talking about. Um,
Right.
but it's like the sovereign needs to have the power in order to enforce the whatever laws and contracts it has established, right?
Hmm.
And if it doesn't have that power, then it can't do that, which means that it is limited. Um,
So let's put it this way. Let's think it out. So if the sovereign has limited power, by the way, that doesn't mean 50%, right? I mean, but
right.
somewhat limited power. Why does that, or in what way does that affect the, let's say, the overall covenant,
The
right? The
Commonwealth
overall
area.
contract.
So
That
I
that's the that,
really the first thing that comes to mind is just like people would find a loophole, right? They would take advantage of the fact that aspect that is limited,
mm-hmm,
right? Like
mm-hmm,
I'm trying to. I don't know if I can think of specifics, but I just feel like if there is a limitation to the power of the government, then people are going to take advantage of that.
mm-hmm,
This
mm-hmm.
might be a Machiavellian way of thinking, but
Right,
I just kind
right,
of think that that's what's going to come about. And then once they take advantage of it, then it's like, oh, the sovereign can't do anything about that.
right.
And then it's like, well, maybe we should change the law so that the sovereign can do something about that. Or, um, yeah, that's kind of my thought process. That's not to say that within the confines of the sovereign that it can be adaptable and it right. Like I think the absolute power is a maximum threshold, right? Like the sovereign is within that power. So they're going to, or whatever, that government, that structure is going to have a subset of that power because of the choices that it makes. Um, right? Oh, did we disconnect? Are you back?
I am back. Sorry, an
Okay,
alarm went off and triggered off the volume for some reason, or the, yeah, sound.
gotcha.
Sorry.
So what did I just say?
You were talking about the importance of absolute power in order to enforce contracts
Yes.
if or the contract, if it is the case that he didn't have, or the sovereign doesn't have absolute power, that at some level there would be loopholes or ways of like getting through the contract.
Yeah.
And I'm just yeah. I think what the problem is, like when I think about like actual contracts,
Yeah.
you know, like whatever, a marriage contract, a business contract, that the force behind it, I mean, there certainly is a force behind it. There's certainly a power behind it. Um, but I'm wondering what I guess the issue is why, you know, I almost feel that in a constitutional government, in many ways, it's the Constitution that's the force. I mean, granted, it it's going to come down to humans at
Yeah.
some level,
Yep.
right?
Hmm.
It's going to come down to a judicial system where a judge passes a judgment,
Hmm.
and then if there's, if one is found guilty, then there will be penalties that will ultimately be you will be forced to do. Either the IRS will start taking your property, or you will be incarcerated. So there will be some type of real world element. The trick that I'm having is what the absolute element is, and in those cases, the whatever the power behind the contract, do they really have, in the case of marriage, in the business contract, do they really have absolute power? In our real world,
Right.
um,
Well, I would
uh,
think yes and no. I think that
yeah,
the maximum capacity is yes, they have unlimited power, but in
right,
reality, it's going to be no because of the system that we have is going to be,
hmm,
there's so many checks and balances that restrict what is brought to the table and what would be turned down. So,
right.
in our system specifically, like in a monarchy, then yes, I would say that it's much more likely for you
Well,
to observe that power.
yeah. Let me ask you this then: what do you think? So if the sovereign has unlimited power, but the what are the aspects that actually would condition that power? So what I mean by that is that you have all of these sort of like natural laws, right? I
Hmm.
think there was even one that was reminiscent. Where was that? Of the I don't know if that was in the natural law section that we read, but there was one that was even reminiscent of the. Maybe this was the liberty section, 21. Oh yeah, it was that sounded very much like the Fifth Amendment, page 269. If a man be
Hmm.
interrogated by the sovereign or his authority concerning a crime done by himself, he is not bound to confess it, because no man can be obliged by covenant to accuse himself. So, that's sort of an interesting case there. I mean, it seems that you have unlimited power, but at the same point, that there are certain aspects of the covenant that um, either, let's put it this way, either limit what the sovereign can do. I want to be careful there because that sounds like it goes against unlimited power, or it provides a liberty for the individual that the sovereign can't touch. See, that still sounds like limited. Do you know what I'm
Wait,
saying?
what is limited?
Well, look, in other words, like, so if he's interrogated by the sovereign, right,
Hmm.
um, concerning a crime that he did, he doesn't have to confess it. So
Yeah.
that's sort of an interesting case there. Like, in
So
other words,
freedom of
the
speech.
in that yeah, but in that case, the sovereign doesn't have total power, because if he had total power, he'd be like, "Hey, tell me right now, did you do the crime? I am the sovereign. You must answer."
Well, of course you can't have total
But in
power in that sense. Like actual power. No, we're talking about legal power. Like, right?
Okay,
Like you can't force someone to speak words out of their mouth. Like that's just not something we as humans have power to do.
yeah, but you could make a no, but you could make a law that said if you don't, there will be repercussions. So if you don't, if when I am asking you questions related to a crime that you were involved with, um, and you don't answer them, there will be this punishment. That's doable.
Mm-hmm.
My point is, I'm wondering whether or not, like, I'm wondering whether or not the sovereign basically has a vast amount of power, but not total power. And what I mean by that is that the very sake of the covenant, or the very ground of the covenant, is to get out of a state of nature, perpetual war. So right there, the sovereign is bound to maintain peace and security. You might add a number of these other laws as well, these other natural laws that I guess flow from the first one or are whatever connected to it. That these are that if these things aren't being enforced, then I don't know. I don't know about this because we haven't finished the book. But whatever. Then at that point you can resist, or at that point you can you can be like, hey, you're not holding up your end of the contract. You're not holding up your end of the bargain.
So I think you might be slightly misinterpreting this section in 21.
Okay.
Because the paragraph before that, it says, so if the sovereign command a man to kill, wound, or maim himself, or not to resist those that assault him, or to abstain from use of food, ire, medicine, or any other thing, without which he cannot live, yet hath the man the liberty to disobey. So it's talking about liberty. It's not talking about
right.
Like contractual obligations. He has the liberty to disobey.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, it's so. Let's see. Dependence not on the words of our submission, but on the intention, which is to be understood by the end thereof. When therefore our refusal to obey frustrates the end for which the sovereignty was ordained, then there is no liberty to refuse, otherwise there is.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's like, I'm trying to understand. I don't feel like it's talking about limiting the power of the sovereignty. It's talking about the freedom that the subjects have, right? Like, you're free to disobey because that, by nature kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not saying that, let me see, wait. So the part you read before was, if a man be interrogated by the sovereign or his authority concerning a crime done by himself, he is not bound, without assurance of pardon, to confess it, because no man, as I have shown in the same chapter, can be obliged by a covenant to accuse himself.
Right.
No man is bound by the words themselves, either to kill himself or any other man. Yeah, I just don't think that that's limiting the sovereign's power.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we might just be like going in a bit of a circle here, and it may be that I'm not being clear, but it seems that if person A wants something done and person B is not doing it, that is a limitation on what person A wants. He at that point, and not only that, he's justifying it, right? Hobbes is justifying his ability not to do that thing. So that, I mean, you're making an interesting distinction between the covenant, or let's say the covenant itself,
Mm-hmm.
laws, and liberty.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a distinction there that matters, then we can clarify that, and then maybe that'll settle it, right? And it's not to say, I mean, here's the flip side is this, that obviously, and I also think that there's sort of like an ideal, and I think he addresses this, right? But an ideal, and then, or if you will, a fair commonwealth, okay? And then probably ones that are more tyrannical, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in other words, ones that are a little bit unfair.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality is that you're not going to get into the contract, you're not going to accept this contract and be servile. You're not going to be, okay, I'm going to accept this contract to be a slave. Tell me to do whatever you want, right?
Yeah.
So the very nature of entering the subject, or I'm sorry, the contract, is it indicates that you are getting something from it. It's a contract, right? It's not like a one-sided contract.
Yep.
So there has to be a pocket of things that are protected. I mean, like peace and security, and therefore, let's put it this way: the fair-minded sovereign would respect that.
Yeah.
You know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess the sort of the tyrannical one, that's where the question comes up,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not we're back into a situation like Thrasymachus, where it's just like, hey, justice is the interest of the stronger, whatever the stronger says goes, you have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So because also too, there's got to be there needs to be something guiding we would want, right? Something to be guiding the dictates of the sovereign. We know in this case that it's going to be at some level the fundamental contract will be guiding those decisions, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, there's a bit of food for thought there on a number of fronts. I will say this on the liberty bit. The 21 is sort of considered a classic chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought what was really interesting, especially in light of what we just read about an individual, right? The sort of Fifth Amendment section, as it were, is that he argues in this section that liberty is not a property of an individual, but it is of a commonwealth.
Okay.
And that's sort of an interesting thing. I mean, like, and I think he's sort of working with the notion in 21 after he goes on this sort of initial sort of exploration of freedom in general or liberty in general.
Mm-hmm.
He then sort of gets down to this notion of what freedom looks like within. Yeah, he talks about freedom and liberty in general, right? Sort of decisions that are made, the causes that precede them, so on and so forth. And then he starts to get, like, on the bottom of 263 to talking about liberty within the context of a commonwealth. But then I want to see where he actually puts this. Do you remember reading it? That issue of liberty being sort of. Okay, here you go. This is 266. The liberty whereof there is so frequent and honorable mention in the histories and philosophy of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and in the writings and discourse of those that from them have received all their learning in the politics, is not the liberty of particular men, but the liberty of the commonwealth,
Mm-hmm.
which is the same with that which every man should have if there were no civil laws nor commonwealth at all. I'm wondering if what he's saying is that, like, prior to the contract, living in a state of nature, you have total freedom, right?
Yep.
But as soon as the contract is developed, you're giving that up, and in so giving that up, it's giving that up to the sovereign. Then the question of liberty doesn't become individual liberty, but it becomes liberty of the commonwealth, which, by the way, I'm not totally clear on.
Sure. I think I follow.
Like,
Yeah.
what you know what I'm saying? Like, what exactly would be the liberty of a commonwealth, of a group? How does liberty play out in that context?
Mm-hmm.
And he even continues the thought down below. He's like, the Athenians and the Romans were free, that is, free commonwealths.
Right.
So again, sort of challenging this notion of sort of the freedom of the individual.
Oh,
Then,
yeah. That's.
then on page 268, he says, to come now to the particulars of the true liberty of a subject. So now we're down to an individual.
Yeah.
And then he develops those.
Right. Yeah, so the liberty of the Commonwealth in that section with the Athenians and the Romans, right after that he says, let's see, had the liberty to resist their own representative, but that the representative had the liberty to resist or invade other people. So it's kind of like what the representative, what the Commonwealth was able to do, what freedom it had with other Commonwealths to a degree. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. But that's tricky to understand. Do you know what I'm saying?
I mean, so basically,
said, but...
I think it's kind of saying basically there isn't really a sovereign between sovereigns, right? Like you've got a sovereign that deals with one commonwealth, and you've got multiple commonwealths in the world. One commonwealth has the power and the freedom to take over another commonwealth. Like there's no external law binding those two together. There's not a sovereign over these sovereigns.
Because there's no contract.
Yes.
There's no meta contract.
Right. So it's not compatible. Yeah, I mean, I assume you could institute something like that, and maybe we have a degree of that in our world. But yeah, I guess, let's see, wait, liberty of the subjects.
I guess the interesting example there would be the United Nations. So the members of the United Nations then, as it will, have the meta contract.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I'm saying? If you're a member of this body, and that body has certain constitutional norms, then in that sense, that would be a contract over sovereigns,
right?
Over sovereignties.
And we have a degree of that with like the U.S. versus the state constitutions.
Right.
That's slightly different, but I think it's similar. It's basically like it's basically like an aspect of the contract, gives the power to a different entity to control that aspect of that contract, right? Like the states have individual powers over laws and over things within the larger, contract of the United States.
Right.
So it's really just a transfer of rights, and that's exactly what a contract is, right? It's a transfer of rights.
Right. You've got you're right. You've got the federal, state, local. But at some level, they're all beholden to the federal.
Yes.
And then there's wiggle room,
meaning,
in other words, like where the federal is silent, the state can, introduce something that would be particular to its state.
Yes, right? And then the state,
or in the case of legalizing marijuana, where it's not silent and speaks very loudly, the state is going against the federal. But because of the nature of whatever changing views of the seriousness of smoking marijuana, the enforcement of it is not as strong. Right? Like, so California, it's legal. Other states, it's legal. Federal, they still haven't changed it.
Right.
But it's not like, it's like, whatever, choose your battles.
Yeah. And then there's like a degree where, instances can come up at the state level and be promoted to the federal level, in which case it's what was the word I was looking for? It's like it becomes a modification of the contracts, like the states, so the United States federal level gives up some of its rights to the state level, but it has power over that contract, which means that if something were to happen that would change the federal law, then it would revoke the contract at the state level, to a degree, or modify it, because it has the powers. The state doesn't have the power over the federal. I mean, you could argue in some sort of, semantic way, it's like, yeah, well, the state makes up the federal and the people are all involved. But, from a more contractual statement, the federal has power over it.
There's certainly a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Easily.
Yeah.
Certainly. So, like, right. So, in other words, you've got, like, let's say, for instance, with Roe v. Wade, At the federal level, then you have a Supreme Court decision that allows for abortions. States, though, so it allows for, but a state, though, could ban it entirely at the level of the state legislature. So, because it's not saying, oh, states, you have to make it legal.
Yeah.
It's, if I'm getting this right, but that seems to,
Yeah, it's giving I mean, that's one of the, I guess it's allowing that freedom to the state.
Right. That'll be interesting when we get to the Federalist Papers, because that's going to be in that there's going to be a massive argument about essentially who should have more power, states or the federal government.
And
another thing I thought was interesting. Yeah, go for it.
I was going to say one thing that we haven't really discussed, but is probably worth noting. Like we're saying that the sovereign has like this absolute power and it can't be punished and that kind of things along that lines. But in reality, it can be overthrown, right? And taken over by the people or other people, other nations. So it can be protested or modified by the people,
right?
With power or with reason, I suppose, right? And I guess that's that's just a human aspect of it.
Because, I think what's interesting though, is that I actually do think that all of the covenant itself, which I don't want to say embodies, but includes these laws of nature. I feel like those laws of nature are almost sort of like constitutional principles that bind the sovereign. So when it comes to like in other words, like you have to hold to these principles. You can't really go against them if you're the sovereign. However, and this is my own interpretation at this point, how you go about implementing them, the style of the you're governing, that's where there's a lot of freedom at play.
Yeah.
Because I'm even looking in 24, which I thought was really interesting, about basically distributive justice, where it was essentially talking about resources, land and other resources need to be equally distributed. And it's like, that's really interesting from a 21st century American perspective, right? Where, well, not even just American perspective, but also sort of like a capitalist perspective, where it's like, no, there shouldn't be like a total, equal distribution of, let's say, monies, resources, land, but you let the marketplace decide it, right? But what's interesting, so that's one piece. But what's interesting is that I'm on 296 bottom of. In this distribution, the first law is for the division of the land itself, wherein the sovereign assigneth to every man a portion according as he, and not according as any subject, or any number of them, shall judge agreeable to equity and the common good. So what seems to be going on there is that the sovereign has to actually, so this would be one of those constitutional principles I was talking about based on these natural laws. The sovereign actually has to distribute land and resources equally. However,
I don't think that's what it says.
The freedom. We can go back to that. However, the freedom is that he is the judge of determining that distribution. But let's go back to the first point. You don't think that's what he's saying?
Well, I mean, it says an arbitrary distribution. Where does it say equal? I don't think there's equal. The sovereign assigneth to every man a portion according as he, and not according as any subject, or any number of them.
And the judge and shall judge agreeable to equity. So equity is going to be an element there, but granted, he's determining all of these pieces.
Yep.
But let's put it this way, like, yeah, I mean, we don't need to necessarily debate the specific point about equal,
So
but
equity
that
just
he
means
just,
fair, right? Just,
yeah.
fair, right? So, I mean, what it's saying is, um, and the common good. So, it's fair according to the common good. So I think like the distribution in our state or in our government is fair because it has to do with, property laws and like what a person can own, what they can afford, and that's fair. It's not saying everyone gets equal division. It's not
No,
saying,
that's fine. No,
right?
no, but let's put it this way: that that he ends up distributing the resources. That's something he must do.
Okay. Well, what if he decides it's fair to not and he just owns it all? But they live there, right? Like I don't um what I don't know.
I'm looking at the example from the Israelites right after. Um,
Like I don't think it's restricting or enforcing that the sovereign do divide it up to the people. Um, it's probably in the best interest to do so, which is why it mentions it. But
hmm
if the common good or equity were not to allow that, then then the sovereign would have the power to do otherwise.
How do you distribute to every man a portion? To go back to your earlier point, if he so chooses not to distribute to any man at all. In other words,
Well,
he does seem bound to have to distribute something to the citizens, let's say,
mhm,
and not just keep it to himself.
right.
That's my point. There
So,
seems to be a
so it's talking about private property, right? Private estates of land.
hmm right.
I could imagine a situation where there is no private property. The sovereign owns it all, but allows the people to stay there, right?
hmm
And in that case, the judge, like, it would be fair because um, it wouldn't, like, the division would just be to one person. I don't know. Like, it's weird to think about, but I guess you'd be trading the privateness with the security or something along the lines of that. Like I'm just arguing from like a theoretical point of view. I don't think
Right.
that it's saying you must divide or distribute the land to all parties. I'm just saying it's like it says you should do that fairly. And if fairly means that everyone gets zero and he gets all of it, that could be valid. Um,
Yeah.
or
I mean, the issue though then would be that is he actually then violating the fundamental principle of the contract, which is peace, and I'm emphasizing the latter part, security. In other words, is it the case that's one could argue that living a secure life, living a peaceable life, is having property and resources.
sure, I
You
don't.
know,
I think you could argue that,
yeah.
but I don't think that goes against
Um,
the law. I like that listed law. Oops.
I'm starting to think more and more that the I guess here's the one issue. The one issue is you have sort of this blank slate sovereign,
Hmm.
and the sovereign that type of like so we're obviously in the abstract. This sovereign can do anything that he wants,
Yes.
and I think that at some level that is, in my opinion, a misreading of Hobbes. Um, because he can't.
Okay.
The fundamental and part of that. So in other words, you could have. I mean, obviously there have been regimes in the past where the monarch can do whatever he wants, and we know that that's a possibility. But I'm not sure if that's in this Hobbesian world, because the contract itself has features that are based on this, as I'm calling it, the fundamental law of nature, peace and security, to get outside of a continual state of war, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you pointed out, because you had read ahead last time, that there were more of these laws of nature,
Mm-hmm.
which he enumerates. And so my point is, if I feel like, as Hobbes sees it, the sovereign actually needs to be working within the context of these laws of nature as he governs.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that is a total limitation, right? Because even in the example of distribution, it is according to how the sovereign sees it, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So in that there's a lot of freedom, and I would argue that that even with all these laws of nature as guiding principles, right? So it's not the sovereign as a blank slate, do what you want. It's the sovereign working within these contractual principles. And by the way, there are a dozen or so of them, right? They're not going to cover everything.
Yeah.
I mean, all of sort of the minutia of administrative life. So there's still, I want to say, within that pocket of how you understand those laws, how you implement those laws, and where those laws are silent, that is where the if you will, the ultimate freedom of the sovereign's power resides.
Mm-hmm.
Are you with me?
I think so. So,
Because
um,
real quickly, let me
yeah.
add to this, Christian, just because it popped in my head. Because otherwise, the contract could be very one-sided, right? And
Right.
therefore not contractual. It betrays the nature of a contract because there's two sides to it, right? Even with the classic covenant between God and Abraham, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will be your God, you will be my people. God has a role to play in this, as well as the human component.
Right.
I don't. It's more. I'm not even trying to create like a nugget for us to figure out. It's more like me to trying to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I it, it it's not anyone is consenting to this. It's literally the tyrant comes in and I imagine has a militia, and it's like I'm in charge,
Yeah.
and that, with everything that Hobbes has laid out, I think contradicts that.
Okay.
And I don't think you're arguing for a Thrasimachus. I think you're arguing for this unlimited power element. And as I see it, there's a lot of power that he has.
Yeah. No, I agree.
But there are
So,
these, yeah.
I think it makes sense, right? Um, I think so. There is probably a more generic sovereign that doesn't have these, what is it, 19 laws of nature, that doesn't follow those, and those would not be what Hobbes is talking about. But I also think that, like you said, within these laws, there's freedom for the sovereign, which means
Hmm.
that you can make compromises in one area, or in one area that benefits another area more justly. I don't know what the right word is. Like,
Right.
for example, you could sacrifice owning private property for protection, and I don't think that goes against any of the 19 laws listed. Um,
Right. Right.
and so I just think that, um, yeah, I agree that the power of the sovereign that Hobbes is discussing might not be unlimited, but I think that it, within the confines of these laws. right? That it
Right.
still
Right.
exists within the confines of these laws, and
Yeah.
these laws are
Yeah.
necessary for contract. I think that's the most important part. Well,
Exactly.
yeah. I think most of these laws are necessary for a contract. Some of them that could be debated.
Exactly. Yeah. Sure. No. Totally. Totally. Um, and I would just add, it's just sort of as a concluding remark, it's absolutely, I mean, other than, some of the sort of old English and certain jags that he goes on,
Hmm.
it's absolutely a really interesting theory. I think out of all the ones that we've seen, I'm not saying it's the most interesting, but it's
Yeah.
I mean, it's a deep theory. It is a interconnected theory, a lot of components at work, um, and as as at some level, it is the basis of our constitutional form of government. It's really intriguing,
Hmm.
these features. It'll be interesting to see, because I think when I first thought, whatever, my sort of like knee jerk, like not reaction, but my sort of surface understanding of Hobbes up to this point, this reread with you, was this whole idea of like state of nature, get out of state of nature, give up your freedom, sovereign rules.
Hmm.
But these pieces of, I was just missing these pieces of the laws of nature, which I find very intriguing. I mean, these are laws of nature that
Cutting out a bit.
yeah, are sort of got interesting law, etc. So it'll be interesting to hop up in Locke, which will be a sort of our last. Oh, let me just take these. Hello,
Yeah, I can hear you.
hello.
You've been cutting out a little
Yeah.
bit.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. And there we go. And how much of that language will also be sort of worked into not just Locke, but also sort of the
Oh no.
foundational documents for the right to life, liberty, and that the rights language will come up, and that'll be interesting to then really talk about. To what degree is a right natural,
Hmm.
or versus artificial. But it'll be interesting to see how much of this other piece that I'd been missing um, will will influence the later writings.
Yeah. Hmm.
By the way, I thought to share, because I shared with you the classic line of life is nasty, brutish, and short. I thought it important to also let you know, I forget where it was, in 17 if you want to look somewhere, but this is another classic line: covenants without the sword are but words.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah.
Which over and over again in different contexts, but it connects with this line of a common power to keep them in awe.
Yeah.
I kept on seeing that over and over again, which I thought was interesting too, because it's not just just all this attention concentrated toward and pomp and circumstance and military bands, right? Right? All of the national songs being sung, right?
Hmm.
I mean, there is this element of awe that comes along with power, and with awe, usually there's an element of reverence and respect, and you can connect maybe other things too, like whatever, service, submission, you know. So, um, so yeah, when you're a dad one day, if that's going to happen,
you need to be that power that creates a sense of awe.
Gotcha.
And then the kids will just be like, he's amazing. We just want to follow his bidding. So, good
Yeah,
talk.
definitely.
All right. So we have